Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Kubernetes Access Controls with Calico Enterprise. I'm your presenter, Andy Wright from Tigera. Before I start, we have a few housekeeping items to cover on this presentation and the webinar platform we're using here. First, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session and will be accessible through the same link you're using now, as well as on Tigera's website under the tigera.io/webinars. It should take about 15 to 20 minutes for the BrightTalk platform and later today for our website. There's a link to a new offering from Tigera listed in the attachment section. I'll be covering what that's all about shortly within the presentation today. And finally, copies of today's slides can be made available. Just email contact@tigera.io and request a copy. So most importantly, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to send it through the Ask a Question tab in your BrightTalk interface. We'll try to take questions as they come, but we will also reserve time at the end of the webinar for a full Q&A session. So today we're going to cover three different topics. We're going to cover the Kubernetes journey and what we've discovered through hundreds of different engagements with companies who are adopting Kubernetes. And we're going to talk about some of the common challenges, and we're going to dive into the details of one of those challenges, which is pod-level access controls. And we'll talk about how Calico Enterprise helps with that particular use case. So we see the Kubernetes journey is typically 5 different stages. And apologies for this, the webinar platform seems to be changing the formatting on this, as well as a few of the other slides talking about the journey here. But in stage 1, this is where there's a lot of education going on. And so learning the basic concepts of Kubernetes and looking into some of the foundations of networking, storage, network security. And in this stage, generally what is happening is that you're determining whether or not Kubernetes is a fit for you and whether it's something that you'd like to spend any more time learning about. And if Kubernetes is a fit for you, generally we move into stage 2. And in stage 2, this is where you're going to have more of a lab environment, a sandbox environment. You might have a couple of cloud instances or some hardware on-prem that you're working with. But generally what you're working on here is to deploy a working cluster and to start to design an operating model. So understand, like, how would this be managed? How would we deploy to it? How would we troubleshoot issues? And during this point in time, you're also starting to think about the architecture that you'd like to deploy to. So stage 3 is generally where we first start running real applications in Kubernetes. And generally, we're going to find something that's not mission critical. It's probably going to be a clone or something that's running in parallel to the real application that end users are using. And in this stage, you're trying to gain confidence that you'll be able to run these applications internally, and you want to build up a little bit of muscle memory on, how does Kubernetes work and how do we resolve issues if they happen, and how do we engage with other teams to get them to deploy their applications. And at the end of stage 3, what we typically see is that whoever's championing this project will go to their management team and ask for budget and ask to create a real initiative to push Kubernetes out into more of a production type application. So that's when we enter stage 4, and within stage 4, we take our first application and we'll deploy that application to production. And generally, this isn't going to be multiple applications serving multiple users. It's probably not going to be your mission critical application, but it will be a production application. And what we'll do is basically prove this out. And once we get into this stage, we're probably going to be engaged with multiple different teams. If we're running a production application, you're going to have a network engineering team you're working with. You're going to have a security team you're working with, in some cases a compliance team. You'll be working with the DevOps engineers and platform engineering. So a lot of people get engaged in this stage, and once it's proven out, then usually other teams want to get in on this opportunity and they'd like to deploy to the Kubernetes platform. And you'll see more applications being rolled out. So we do have a poll in the webinar platform, and we are very interested to hear from you. If you feel like you're at one of these stages of the journey, we'd love to see that. Now, there's different challenges or different needs that typically occur at the different stages of this Kubernetes journey. Across stage 1 and 2, generally what's needed is just basic training, learning best practices. You might be going to meetups, you might be talking to other peers, you may engage with different consultants. You want to learn how it might integrate into your enterprise environment. How would this integrate into the cloud environment we're using? How would this integrate into the on-prem environment? Generally, you're going to need to start to learn, how do you troubleshoot things? And this is all just about the learning experience. As you move into more running a pilot or pre-production stage, what we see are really 3 different hurdles that folks have to get through. The first is what we call pod level access to external resources. So Kubernetes applications, they may need to connect to things that are not inside of the cluster. This could be a database, this could be a cloud service, this could be, a variety of different, it could be another application, an API. And that's really the first challenge, and we'll talk more about that today. We also see visibility and troubleshooting as an issue. So if a problem does occur within the cluster, how do you dig in and understand where the problem is and go quickly resolve it? And we also look at security controls, and these can be fairly basic security controls in many cases. It could be we need isolation between a development and a production environment. There could be more advanced security controls as well. For example, this is an application that needs to be GDPR compliant, or this platform needs to eventually have a SOC 2 certification, and how do we do that? So today, what I'm going to talk about is the pod level access. We'll cover some of the other challenges in future webinars. And let me just walk through a little bit of the challenge. So, Kubernetes applications are, Kubernetes is going to be orchestrating containers, and in most cases, in the first steps of this journey, these aren't necessarily microservices that are being deployed to Kubernetes. Oftentimes, their existing applications are being containerized and being deployed to the platform. So, in the case of new applications, they will oftentimes need storage, so they might need to be working with an S3 bucket, for example. They'll need to be interacting with data. They'll probably have a database, and oftentimes they'll be working with third-party APIs. If you're taking an existing application and migrating it to Kubernetes, oftentimes those applications are going to need to connect to a myriad of other resources that may be in your data center or in your cloud. But the key point here is that these applications aren't really an island within Kubernetes. They generally have to connect outside. And so, for an example, you may want to have one specific pod that connects out to an RDS database that has some customer data, for example. You may have another pod that connects out to an S3 bucket. You may have, there are some problems with the webinar platform here, but and oftentimes, that data is going to be housed inside of a security group. You might also have pods that connect out to third-party APIs. For example, you might need some telco-type services and connect out to a Twilio. Now, the challenge here is, allowing access. because you probably, within your operating model, don't want all pods to be able to connect to that database, for example, right? You want to be able to specify which ones should be allowed to. And if you look at the case of, you know, an AWS, for example, and working with security groups, you know, your option for access controls is to either put in a CIDR range, an IP address, or a security group. So, you know, which do you use? If you want to use a CIDR range, then you basically give the entire cluster access to that resource. So, for example, anything that would be deployed to Kubernetes would be allowed to connect to that RDS database or that S3 bucket. And that's probably not the best option, because in most cases you want to be able to control access, and you'll have security teams and data owners who will want to make sure that only the specific workloads that are allowed to connect can connect. So IP address is an interesting one to use. However, Kubernetes will dynamically assign those IP addresses to pods. And so as you do things like you scale up, you scale down, if you experience an issue and Kubernetes redeploys a pod, you know, the security group is going to start blocking access, and what will happen is you'll actually experience some outages. And so this option is probably not a really good option either. Using a security group, you can put your cluster in a security group. However, now the entire cluster again has access, which is not, it's not going to be secure. It's not typically going to be allowed to roll out into a production type setting. On-prem, these same issues are the same. If you're in different clouds, the concept of security group could be different. You know, firewall rules, you know, network security groups on Azure. It's all pretty much the same. If you're on-prem, generally firewalls are used here. And again, the firewalls are going to be really focused more on IP addresses. And we'd already talked about this, but the IP addresses really don't work because the Kubernetes pods are dynamic. So this is where Calico Enterprise comes in to help solve this particular problem. Calico Enterprise is an enterprise version of the free and open source Calico. What you get with it is a web user interface, which makes it easier to work and allows more people to get involved with the Kubernetes project. It provides visibility into the network, troubleshooting tools, a policy workflow, which enables you to roll out changes into your cluster without incurring any kind of downtime, and access controls outside the cluster, which is the focus of today's discussion. We also offer some more advanced capabilities as you move into stages 4 and 5, such as compliance reporting, threat defense. We block a lot of the common hacks that you can find in the news, for example. And we also do multi-cluster federation, where you get to the point that you have multiple teams running multiple clusters, and you'd like to basically manage those all in a central way. So the solution that we're offering with Calico Enterprise is you know, how to limit egress from one specific pod out to one specific resource. And we want to do this based on network policy. So Calico Enterprise has extended the network policy model to include egress rules that can connect to DNS endpoints. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, if you notice, this is a RDS instance, and the best practice here is to connect to the instance using a fully qualified domain name. And the IP addresses of the underlying instance could be changing within the cloud environment as well, but the FQDN, fully qualified domain name, will stay static. And so this is really the best practice to connect to any resource, you know, whether that be on-prem or also in the cloud. And within the Calico model and our network policies, we offer something in addition to what's available in the open source, which is called allowed egress domains. So in this case, what you can do is you can define a fully qualified domain name as well as a port, and you can allow one specific pod or set of pods based on a label selector access to that external resource. And so ultimately what this enables you to do is simplify Kubernetes integration into your environment. And when you're going to deploy and you need to connect to existing applications that are running either in the cloud or on-prem, you're going to need to be able to specify the specific workloads that connect to it. Generally, the database owners, as well as the security team, don't want just any workload to be able to connect. So this keeps you compliant with the security requirements, and it'll also enable this incremental migration of existing applications. Oftentimes, what we see is that there are initiatives to modernize and move to containers, and but it's very, very hard to just rewrite these applications. So when they move into a containerized environment in Kubernetes, they're generally going to need to be able to connect to some of those other applications outside of the cluster. So this is the offer that I talked about. If you'd like to try this out on your own, we have a free trial of Calico Enterprise. It's on tigera.io/trial. The free trial, what it is it's a hosted environment, so you don't have to install anything. You don't have to have a server. You just fill out your information. Once we validate that you're a real person and not somebody who's trying to perhaps do Bitcoin mining, et cetera, on our environment, we provision the trial environment. And so you get Calico fully installed with a Kubernetes cluster. You get access to the GUI. And we also offer a guide that helps walk you through this use case around pod level access controls. So give the trial a go if this is a challenge that you believe you have. So I'm just going to close it out for now for Q&A. It's a relatively short presentation today. Okay, looks like we don't have any questions today. You know, if you do have any questions, feel free to follow up with us at contact@tigera.io. This webinar will be available online, and we'd invite you to try the trial of Calico Enterprise. Thanks so much.